I'm here with Heidi Armstrong, and it's a real pleasure to be able to speak with you today, Heidi. Heidi has a background as a Division I swimmer. She was also a professional mountain bike racer, and she unfortunately had a life-changing injury while she was cross-country skiing, which she'll talk more about during our chat today. She is the founder of the Injured Athlete Toolbox, where she provides coaching and support for injured athletes. Great to have the chance to chat with you, Heidi.
I'm so glad to be chatting with you, Les.
Maybe you can talk more about your background as a swimmer and then eventually how you got into mountain bike racing.
Okay, so I'll kind of skip over some of the swimming stuff because it wasn't a real high point in my life. Honestly, it was a very pressure-filled, stress-filled situation. I think it was for a lot of the girls on our team, and fortunately, the NCAA is very different right now in terms of rules and ethics and whatnot. But my journey out of swimming involved me just deciding I didn't want to do it anymore for a multitude of reasons. But I drove one night with my parka, my pull buoy, my paddles, my kickboard, and my fins to Goodwill, and I pulled around the back and I dumped them out by the leave your stuff here place, and I left. That was my exit.
It sounds
and
like
then
you had a lot of equipment there that you were unloading.
Yeah. Yeah, but I mean, it's swimmers, right? So it's not like here's the most of the equipment, right? It's not like a bike or equestrian or something. But yeah, and then I started on the road after that, and then one of my friends introduced me to mountain biking, and that's actually a funny story. So I live in Austin, Texas, and the substrate here is limestone, which means that the riding is very, very technical. And so my friend convinced me to rent a mountain bike and go on this very gnarly trail, whereupon I pushed the bike about 95% of the time and cussed the other 5% of the time. And then I think I walked the whole thing, and I said, how do you ride on any of this? This is ridiculous. And he said to me, if you can ride a mountain bike here, you can ride a mountain bike anywhere. And it was absolutely true. And I was really fortunate to have a bunch of really skilled riders who were patient enough that if I needed to master a skill, or there was a scary ledge or a drop off or something technical, they would stand and form this kind of two walls on either side of me, and they would spot me up stuffs until I got more confidence and learned how to do things. And it was really a privilege to have friends that weren't about just going out and thrashing each other on the bike, but wanted to see me grow as a rider. And so I love mountain biking. I could talk about it for hours.
Well, it sounds like they started you in kind of at the deep end. There wasn't much of an easy transition.
Yes, it was, they hazed me for sure, but they were nice about it, kind of.
And so I guess what was so appealing about mountain biking?
The fact that everything else goes away. It's my only focus when I'm on the trail. And it's a fantastic metaphor for life. So I'm full of knitting and mountain biking metaphors. But in order to ride a mountain bike fast and well, you have to look a little bit down the trail, and you always have to look around the corner, and you have to look where you're going. So one of my mentors told me, hey, Heidi, the fastest way to crash on a mountain bike is to look where you don't want to go. So if there's a scary ledge or a scary rock that you don't want to ride off or hit, just look at it and you're going to crash. Yeah. And so it's look where you want to go, look a little bit down the road, don't look too far down the road, and don't look right in front of your wheel, because then you're not going to see what's coming next.
Yeah.
And so it's very fast thinking. And then it also gave me a lot of confidence to take on and master the terrain around here, because it's some pretty burly riding. Yeah. We don't have mountains, we don't have really long climbs, but we have a lot of technical riding.
Yeah, and I guess, you have to probably respond to a lot of changing cues very quickly, right?
Yeah,
and, yeah. Sort of ironically, you mentioned that if you actually focus in on something you don't want to do, namely an area you're trying to avoid, you're more likely to make that happen.
Yep.
So And how long, I guess, kind of from your start in mountain biking, did you continue to progress? I know you competed professionally, so you
Hmm.
must have made strides and
Yeah,
continued to ride, I guess.
I did. Yeah. So I competed professionally for a number of years, and I went from my rental bike to owning a bike to being sponsored by Specialized, and then I raced professionally, and didn't race for a few years, but kept riding. So it's a little bit of in and out of the sport. Uh, Switched over to riding more on the road, then went back to mountain biking. But I think as far as being on a bike, it's my true love is being on a trail in nature. uh, I love that in 10 minutes I can see things on a bike that most people would never see in a lifetime.
Yeah. Well, like you say, I guess it's a great way to not only challenge yourself, but to be outside. And of course, nowadays,
Yeah.
we're, especially now, I guess, disconnected sometimes from other individuals or from the outside world at
Or
times.
from our own selves, right?
Sure, sure.
Yeah.
And so, was it in the course of your mountain bike racing that you had an injury, or I think it actually, I mentioned it was in cross country skiing that you hurt yourself.
Yeah,
Is that
yeah.
right?
I've had two injuries, and you know the the way that we learn how to do things the right way is by doing them the wrong way, right? And
Yeah.
so I did injury the wrong way once, and it was so wrong. I mean, I don't do anything a little bit. I do it all the way. And so
Hmm.
I did it all the way wrong. And so that was a mountain biking crash. And after that, this was in 2000. So I'm a easygoing, even-tempered person, and I just turned in. My fuse was about that short, and I was angry all the time. And I crashed up in Pennsylvania at a national championship series race, ended up racing, came home. It played out over about 4 years before I finally got better.
Hmm.
And I had a couple of surgeries in there, but my real turning point was my best friend, who's like a sister to me because I'm an only child. She's also my stunt double. We look a
Stunt
lot
double.
alike. Yeah, yeah,
Okay.
she's my stunt double. So people
You-
mistake us for each other all the time. So in Austin, there was this coffee shop that we both used to go to, and I left my jacket there one day, and then a couple weeks later, Christine went in, and Matt, the owner, said, "Oh, here, I have your jacket. You left it." And she just knew. Yeah, her brain just instantly thought,
Yeah.
it's not my jacket, it's Heidi's. Okay, thanks, Matt.
Yeah. Sounds like a good support to
Yeah,
have there.
yeah. So she
Really
had an
good.
intervention with me that involved me compulsively cleaning cassette tapes in 2000. So I don't know why I had a cassette tape collection, but I did. I'm not a hoarder. I should have
Yeah,
been.
I'm just trying to think, when were cassette tapes? I think it was well before 2000 that they
they
probably
were
went out
they
of
were
date.
completely obsolete in 2000.
Yeah.
But my knee was the size of a cantaloupe, and I was supposed to be on it, lying down with my leg above my heart. So I had a complication from surgery. And she came home. I was cleaning cassette tapes. I was surrounded by paper towels and Windex on the floor. And she came in and she said, what are you doing? And I said, I'm cleaning the cassette tapes. And she said, she's also a physical therapist, by the way. She said, I thought you were supposed to be on the couch with your leg up. And I said, if I don't clean these cassette tapes, who's going to clean them?
That is a legitimate point.
Yeah. And but then the next question is why, right?
Yeah.
So she looked at me and she said, I'm going to go in my bedroom for 10 minutes. And when I come out, we're going to have a talk. And I said, okay. And she sat down in front of me 10 minutes later, and she looked at me and she said, pointing to the paper towels and Windex on the floor, you cannot do this anymore. You need to get help. And that's all she said to me.
Yeah. You're
And
going to run out of paper supplies from the sounds of it with the
right, there's not
compulsive.
enough Windex in the world. And so the first thing I thought was, I better have a comeback. It's like, it's instinctive for us to be defensive. And I stopped myself and I took a breath and I thought, that was really brave of her to say, because she didn't know how I was going to react. I could have lashed out at her. And it was a very brave thing of her to just be so direct and be so loving and be, you know, it was putting her in a really vulnerable place. And I thought she must really care about me a lot.
Right.
And so I just looked at her and I said, okay. And that was it. That was the whole conversation. And so the first thing I did was I went to psychotherapy, and that relieved some of the pressure. And then a real turning point for me was my physical therapist, Doug Kelsey, I call him Kelsey. I was at PT one day and he could tell I was angry, and he sat on his stool, rolled it up to me, and he said, "You've got to use your brain in other ways." And I said, okay. And he said, "You're a scientist. I want you to go get a camera, a single lens reflex camera, and I want you to learn how to use it on manual. So you can't use any automatic settings." And he said, "I want you to start learning about the physics of lenses and light, and begin to engage your brain in other ways." And so I had this long recovery ahead of me, and I thought, what do I have to lose? So I did. And I found that when my brain was engaging and learning something new, and I was creating and behind a camera, that I had all the space for my injury. So I could basically unblend for my injury. So I wasn't my knee, and I had less pain. I had less stress. I wasn't angry all the time. It created this interesting space where I could begin to feel and process some of the emotions and grieve and just move through my injury with so much more grace. And so I thought, that is really good for my brain, whatever that is. I didn't know at the time. And so I started picking other things that I could do every day to help myself, like writing prompts and some yoga that was adapted to my physical capability at the time. And I started to feel better and better mentally and emotionally. And then a real turning point for me, kind of some external validation of that work that I had done, is my surgeon called me one day and he said, "Hey, Heidi, I have this patient who's an injured athlete, and I don't think he needs psychotherapy at this point, but he needs to talk to someone else who's been in the hole and knows the way out. Can I give him your number?" And I said, "Absolutely." And so that's how this all started, on an informal basis.
Yeah. So a few questions with your knee injury. What was it that you actually did, Heidi?
Yeah, I had severe osteochondral damage. So on the backside of my kneecap, or my patella, pieces of bone and cartilage broke off. So I had a bunch of small lesions back there, and it's very difficult to heal them. It takes a very controlled progressive load and then controlled progressive strengthening.
Yeah.
So I had a quad that basically shut down, and I don't think it worked for more than a year.
Mm-hmm. And so you were competing, or you were mountain biking at the time with that dysfunctional quad?
So no, I wasn't. The injury happened. It was in the fall when it happened, and then I went about a year before I had a proper diagnosis, which has kind of been a theme with my injuries.
Yeah.
And then it took a couple of surgeries to fully address the issue, but as a result of the trauma and the surgeries, my quad just said, "I'm going on vacation. See you later."
Right. It wasn't working.
And so I was not competing during that time because my leg just wasn't functional.
Right.
So that was the time that I spent rebuilding the rest of my body, which I think is one of the fantastic opportunities in injury that people often overlook. You know, people will say, "I only want to run, and if I can't run, I'm going to sit on the couch and watch Netflix." Well, you're missing this whole area of gray in the middle where you could be rebuilding different parts of your body that you don't have time to focus on. So I did that. And then I spent the rest of the time training my brain.
Yeah. And was just going back to that point that your physiotherapist mentioned, learning about the camera, was that just like, did you have some prior interest in that, or why that in particular? Was it just sort of a random suggestion?
It was, I'll just say Kelsey's a magician.
Yeah.
He just knows. He just knows. He just is so strongly intuitive. He was trying to think of some kind of outlet for me and some kind of skill that I could learn that would tap into other things that I love.
Right.
And he just thought of the camera.
Right. And so I guess speaking of tapping into other things you love, are you someone who's interested or intrigued with technical things, or like kind of, you mentioned as a scientist, or you're a scientist?
Yeah.
So,
I mean, I love all things chemistry and I enjoy reading journal articles, but before this injury, before my first injury, so this was, you know, the first knee injury, I have a whole other injury that kind of took it up to 11 after that. But I realized that I can't just live in one dimension,
yeah.
right? I can't, my life has to have some fault tolerance, meaning that if my primary identity and my pillar is one pillar, and that is that I'm an athlete, if that pillar falls, I'm nothing. I realize I can't have that anymore. And so I begin to learn new things and volunteer and, you know, creativity and art and all these other things. And so it wasn't necessarily technical stuff that I continued to tap into with my other interests and things that I learned. But I think Kelsey he intuitively knew that he needed a hook that would take my brain to a place that was comfortable and familiar, and that was science.
Yeah. And it sounds like in doing that, in drawing your attention away from a sole or primary focus just on your injury and your recovery, that it really had mind-body benefits. Is that accurate?
Absolutely, absolutely. Because my recovery was stalling and just going at such a slow pace because of all of the perseveration and the concern and the worry about my knee, and all my energy was going toward just stress,
Right.
anxiety, anger, right? It's all your sympathetic nervous system. And then you're releasing all these stress hormones. And we have data that show that affects recovery negatively. And so once I began to change the neurochemistry, it changed the biochemistry, and then my body started to heal.
Yeah. Yeah. So again, kind of that interplay of mind body, right? As you say, when you're experiencing that stress, or just, you know, continuing to have those circular thoughts about your injury that go on and on, that impacts the physiology of what's happening in your body, which can influence healing processes in the body.
Exactly.
And I also really like, Heidi, your analogy of the pillar, right? I'm just thinking of a table, right? So it's like, if you have a table on the one pillar, you kick out the pillar and you flatten, right? Whereas if there's other pillars, other interests, other areas to focus on, that you can still keep the table standing and still keep it strong in some way.
Absolutely. Yeah. And I hear from a lot of my clients, oh, I'm not creative, or I don't have a creative bone in my body. And I don't believe that about anybody, because when we were kids, that's all we did, right? That's how we play. And as we get older, we just build layer upon layer of stress and busyness and life on top of that creativity.
Yeah.
And it obscures it to the point that we just don't even identify with it anymore. And so one of the exercises I actually have people do, if they have that kind of resistance, is I say, close your eyes for a couple minutes, open your eyes, set a timer for 5 or 10 minutes, and write down all the things you loved to do as a kid. You know, make mud pies, dig a hole in the dirt, play with Legos, play with Lincoln Logs, like whatever it is you liked doing as a kid, write it all down.
Yeah.
And that will begin to get their mind thinking about the things that used to bring them joy.
Right. And also, just kind of one thought I had in terms of when you're asking people about their skills or their abilities, I guess, like, often, as you alluded to, we may discount the fact that we have certain abilities, but I guess a lot of it has to do with just sort of what we're socialized into, right? Like, I have a friend he does construction, and like, he's very handy, and I don't have a handy bone in my body, but like, looking at his background, like, he was socialized into that, right? And so it may not be that maybe I do have handy bones in my body. It's just that wasn't what I was exposed to growing up. And so I think that's interesting, I guess, just getting people to think about or opening their a range of possibilities to the fact that they might have skills or abilities and to try whether it's cameras or anything else might be helpful.
Yeah, it's kind of like muscles, right? Like we have the muscles to do whatever we want, but some of them are not developed, and we need to make them stronger before we realize, oh yeah, I do have a bicep. It is strong, right?
Right. It's there. It just needs to be developed, honed,
Exactly.
worked on.
Yeah.
So you had this, a number of surgeries, and it sounds like there were, frustrations, complications, but then you mentioned that it went to another degree with your second injury.
Yes.
So maybe you can talk a little bit more about what you experienced with your second injury.
Yes. So I should mention that in between my first and second injury, that I made it all the way back to the level at which I was racing before, but I decided to switch focus, and I focused more on endurance riding. So 6 and 12-hour races, endurance type events. And for me, racing has never been about beating the other person or coming in first. It was, how can I train appropriately? And it was a race against myself.
Yeah.
Right. So how can I push myself the hardest, fuel the best, be smart about certain things, like where to expend energy, where not to, where to develop skills. And so it was always bettering myself.
Right.
And as a consequence of that, I would end up generally doing well in races, but I never identified with winning or.
Yeah. So where did that kind of focus on self-mastery and improvement, or sort of self-reference standards of success, come from?
Horses.
Yeah.
Explain. So
Elaborate.
So I grew up on the back of a horse, and I consider horses and dogs to be my first teachers and the first influencers in my life. And on a horse, unless you are right with yourself, you can never be right with the horse. And so the way that plays out is, if you sit on the back of a horse and you're nervous and you're uptight and you're just thinking this horse is going to spook on me, or it's going to start running off and I'm not going to be able to control it, horses feel that tension. They feel it in the reins. They feel it in the way you're sitting on their back, and they will take off. So exactly what you don't want to happen happens.
Yeah.
And then the rider instinctively pulls back on the reins, and that, makes the horse's head back up, right? And then the more you pull and the more you want them to stop, the faster they go. Yeah. And so the second that the rider relaxes, the horse begins to respond.
Right. So it forces you to get yourself into a certain frame of mind before
absolutely
you can work with the horse and have the horse kind of work with you.
Yep. But if I never suggest that somebody who's having a horrible day and a bunch of stress, whatever, anxiety, go sit on a horse and ask it to do something complicated. Because a good horse will give you direct feedback about that. They'll reflect back to you what you put into them.
Yeah, so they're like a mirror to what you're actually experiencing or feeling inside yourself.
Exactly.
And so kind of that background, I guess you were suggesting, helped you develop that kind of mastery-oriented focus with your riding. Is that right?
Mm-hmm.
And what, if any, effect did that have on your career or your performance as a rider?
That's a really good question. I think it made me constantly focus on myself and doing the best that I could, and leaving everything that I had that day on the trail.
Yeah.
And it also gave me the awareness and appreciation that we're human beings, and what we have to give from day to day and week to week changes.
Right.
And so just like when you get on a horse, the horse that you ride on Tuesday is not the horse that you're going to ride on Thursday. You know, it could be in a bad mood. It could have, you know, some weird kicking kinks to work out. I mean, you never know, right? And so it gave me an appreciation for the fluidity of performance.
Yeah. Would
But
you say those lessons helped you in some way with your own injury experiences, or I want to talk more about with the work that you do with injured athletes?
Not initially, because I had what all injured athletes have, which I call when you're stuck in the bottle, you can't read the label.
Mm-hmm.
And so I was so stuck in this bottle of anxiety and pain and anger that I couldn't see outside of it. And it was Christine that read the label. Like, she was the one that said, hey, you know, as I said, hey, you can't do this anymore.
Yeah.
Right. Which is one of the things that maybe we should talk about a little later on, which is the research that I did with injured athletes.
Yeah, sure.
And you know, recipes for success. But I think going back to mountain bike racing, that intense focus on doing the best that I could and allowing that to play out in a race, and not really worry about what was going on around me too much, but worrying about what was just right down the trail, that came from horses. Horses taught me that. And I noticed a lot when I was racing that, especially in long races, it's a mental test, and it's a test of how well do you know your physiology and what you need from a hydration and nutrition perspective.
Right.
And so I found that there were many occasions where I would fuel myself better than somebody that was faster than me.
Mm-hmm.
And then that would end up playing out that I would end up placing ahead of that person. Right. So there's so many, and that's one of the things I loved about endurance racing, is there's so many pieces to the puzzle to play around with.
Right. Would you say, particularly in the case of endurance events, that it's important to know and understand your body, or to listen to its signs and cues?
All of it. Yeah. It makes you turn inward so much more than a shorter race, because it's a lot easier to maybe fake isn't the right word, but kind of fake it in a smaller race. And so like, fake your conditioning or your nutrition, you know, it can be a little bit off. And if you're a little bit off over the course of an hour and a half, doesn't matter so much. Right. But if you're a little bit off and you're going for 6 or 12 hours, well, then you're gonna end up over here.
Yeah.
Right.
It's gonna catch up to you more in the long run.
Exactly. Yeah.
So, and in terms of your attentional focus, I mean, just in reference to the longer races that you started doing, maybe you can talk about how your focus would shift either inward or outward, and what would sort of prompt changes in your focus over the course of the race.
When I was doing long races, I would focus on, usually they're laps, not always, but a lot of times they're laps. So what was my strategy and purpose for each lap? Was it to go out hard and then kind of collect myself and ride at a tempo, and, you know, planning out the timing of fuel and hydration? But honestly, when I was racing, it was my watch that would go off, you know, a beep to prompt me to drink, or I'd go through the start finish line and my support team would be there, and that would prompt me to eat or, you know, change something out. But my mind would just kind of go off somewhere else.
Mm-hmm.
So
you weren't necessarily focused on the competitors, or more just like you would disassociate?
Yeah, I mean, it was truly a state of flow for me. So I kind of lost track of time, would just really pay attention to the trail, not pay so much attention to who was around me, and just lose myself in the race.
Yeah. Interesting. I mean, I suppose, like, maybe in a longer distance race, would you say there's less of a need to be aware of where your competitors would be?
I think it really depends on the person.
Yeah.
So a lot of people, I tend to be very non-traditional in terms of my approach to racing and just generally the way that I'm wired.
Yeah.
It's kind of weird and different. So that's what worked for me, and that's what made it fun for me. And whenever swimming got to the point of not being fun anymore, and I told myself I don't ever want to do that anymore.
Right.
So when I'm moving, I want it to be fun.
Yeah.
And it might hurt, that's fine, hurt in a good way, but I always wanted it to be fun.
Right.
And
yeah, to experience joy or enjoyment through moving or moving.
Right.
To the body.
And for me, the definition of fun is not, it does not involve being hyper conscious of who's around me and who I need to chase and, who's coming up on me from the rear. I would just let those things play out. I just let go of them.
Yeah.
Because in a race that's long, it falls apart and it comes back together, and it falls apart and it comes back together. And so to try to predict and move things around at the beginning of race, it's, so many factors come into what's going to happen at the end. Like I was saying, nutrition, conditioning, weather, heat, cold, humidity, all those things. And we all have different tolerances and preferences. And so
it sounds like you can almost create your own stress just by thinking about those multitude of external factors.
Oh yeah, for sure.
Yeah.
For sure.
And you mentioned pain or good pain. Maybe you can talk about kind of pain management, either in terms of your performance or just going back to injury, kind of the role of being able to manage one's pain.
Yeah, pain is such a deep topic. I'll try to touch on it a little bit, but there's a big difference between hurting and being hurt. And so that's how I approach pain. And so when I'm racing, I'm hurting.
Yeah.
And I know, and I'm intuitive enough about my own body, that if I experience pain, which I didn't when I was racing, fortunately, that my body was saying to me, you have to stop now. I didn't ever feel like, I had this conversation with myself. If this ever happens during a race, I will respect my body and stop. That said, a lot of athletes generally lack self-compassion.
Right.
And interestingly, you know the work of Kristen Neff?
Yeah.
Yeah, so one of her grad students, Ashley Kutcher, who I interviewed, is getting her PhD in self-compassion in athletes.
Right.
And so we've had a whole conversations about this, but I think that athletes who don't recognize when they're being hurt, it's born of a lack of self-compassion.
Sure.
The roots of which can go back to other things, but I made that promise to myself, because there were times when I was swimming where I would beat myself up, for what purpose?
Right.
It did nothing for me. And at the end of the day, if I walked away from the pool because I pushed myself too hard and my shoulder hurt, I would have to go home and nurse myself. And my coach got to go home and, do whatever she did at night and not worry about the fact that I was nursing myself at home. Right. And so, I am ultimately the steward of my own body.
Right.
And then being hurt it's ouch pain, right? I mean, we know what that is, but I think as athletes, we are taught and conditioned to push through pain, to ignore pain, and that speaking up about pain is weakness.
Right.
And I've never seen it that way.
Yeah, well, and I think, you mentioned that idea of self-compassion. I guess for many athletes, they may not understand sort of the term as it's used in a scientific or social science. standpoint, and it's like, well, why would I want to go easy on myself? And it's like, well, that's not quite what we mean by the term or the expression. And to do so, as you alluded to, may seem inconsistent with this idea of, well, if I'm going to be a real athlete, I have to work through pain. And admittedly, of course, sport brings a lot of challenge, and I really like your distinction of hurting versus being hurt. Sometimes I guess athletes they're not necessarily aware of those distinctions, or they don't always listen to their body, as you mentioned, when they are experiencing being hurt.
Yes. And I think we can also be pretty short-sighted.
Yeah.
So I need to make it to the next competition, or I need to, make it through the season. Ultimately, though, ignoring being hurt once inevitably leads to being hurt again, and ignoring that and ignoring that and ignoring that. So injuries accumulate. If you have a dysfunction somewhere in your body, all your fascia is going to communicate differently, your muscles are going to contract in different ways, and that imbalance and dysfunction will lead to more injuries that accumulate. But often athletes, again, stuck in the bottle, can't read the label. They're not able to see those things. Yeah,
sure. Well, and having a past injury tends to predict future injury. And as you say, maybe part of that is a consequence of the imbalances that the initial injury creates, and the ramifications it has for other parts of the body, or how the body works together. So you mentioned, talk a little bit, Heidi, about what happened with this second injury.
Okay. So as I mentioned, I made it back to racing, and racing season was over. Went to West Yellowstone in Montana, cross-country skiing, was in a race, and to make a long story short, there was a pile up in a race. So just like a bunch of bikes crashing, it was skis. So, yard sale everywhere, skis, people, etc. And I heard a couple of snaps in my knee. So I thought I probably just tore my ACL. I had to walk about 3 kilometers back to the trailhead. And I'm not even really sure how I did that. Probably adrenaline. But I ended up fracturing my knee and tore a ligament, and it was a very rare type of fracture. So I had surgery in Austin, a couple surgeries in Austin, and they ended up just digging me a deeper hole. So by the time I had my first surgery, I had a condition called arthrofibrosis. So arthro meaning joint and fibrosis meaning scarring. So it happens most commonly in knees, and my knee was just globally scarred. So it was scarred everywhere. That was a consequence of the bleeding from the fracture, and the clotting cascade thereafter led to the scarring. And so the surgeon I had in Austin did the best that he knew how, but it used the wrong tools in my knee. I ended up going to the Steadman Clinic in Vail, Colorado. And that was a year after my accident. So in that first year, I was working in the medical device industry. And so my job entailed standing in surgical cases for hours and hours. And that first year, I wasn't sure if I was hurting or being hurt, but I was in a lot of pain that first year. But I kept going and kept going. And it was October of 2011 when I went to the Steadman Clinic and saw Dr. Steadman and got a proper diagnosis. And that's when I had to quit everything. So for people who are watching who are old enough to remember, I say I just gave my life the pink slip. So I had to quit everything. So I had to quit my job, all my volunteer work, all my social engagements. I mean, everything was just, I was done with everything. And that was starting in December of 2011, the first of 6 surgeries I had there. Because arthrofibrosis is not a break-fix condition. It's a chronic condition that requires multiple different interventions, but the surgical intervention is the primary tool, and it's just a process of releasing the scar and making it functional again. And it can grow back. It's very complex and complicated, but anyway, it was on the bike, physical therapy after my first surgery. I was next to an active NFL player on my left. And so this guy was like, he swallowed the bike. He was enormous. And then I was in the middle, and I'm about 6 feet tall. And then there was a guy on my right who was about 5'5". So it was like giant, medium, small. And we're all riding. And, you know, the guy on my left is younger than I am. The guy on my right is older than I am. And we're all talking. And I realized we have the same story. You know, we have hip, knee, and knee, different sports, football, you know, mountain biking, skiing, and then downhill skiing. But we were having the same experience. And I thought, you know, the athletes with whom I'd worked in the prior 10 years when I was doing my work informally, I noticed they had common sufferings and they were using common language. And so I just quit my job, and I thought, you know, I'm heading into 2012, and I'm probably going to end up spending the whole year on my back. So yeah, 2012 is officially the year I spent on my back. And so I was either in the constant passive motion machine doing PT or going to the bathroom. That's it. And so I thought, go ahead.
You had 6 operations in the span of a year, or what was the time frame?
So I had 6 operations in the span of 3 years, but 5 of them were within 13 months.
Right.
And then I had a little break. So these 2 guys I was next to in PT, I thought, I want to do some research and figure out, is this true? Is this pattern that I'm seeing universal? What's going on? And so I interviewed more than 200 injured athletes, and the youngest one was 14 and the oldest one was 78. And I made a list of all the sports I could think of, and I found people that had varying levels of proficiency within those sports, and divided the interviewees into about 50% male, 50% female. And I interviewed them all, and I wanted to find common words. So I just asked them to tell their story. What did you experience after their injury? So I had questions that I asked people.
Yeah.
A lot of notes. And it was completely obvious almost right away, though I kept on with the research, that people were using the same 4 words to describe the emotional fallout of injury. And so people would say frustrated, impatient. Males tended to say angry more than females, and females would say sad more than males would. But I mean, I'm female and I was angry all the time. And then disconnected. So both disconnected from their social network, their friends, their teammates, a lot of athletes, their teammates are their family. So that disconnection, and the disconnection from their body. And then the other thing I wanted to figure out was, what common habits did people have that seem to garner resilience from their injury? So, you know, some people, they get kicked down and they get back up again, and they say, that sucked and I don't ever want to go through it again, but it made me the athlete and the person I am today. So I wanted to figure out, what are they doing that's different than all of these other people? And so it was creativity, like I discussed before. And they did not use the word should or could. So they extinguished those words from their vocabulary because they said those words denigrated. And it made them either depressed or anxious, depending on which word they used. They had someone in their life like Christine, so someone that is a label reader, and someone that they would believe if something went wrong or they were having an issue, and then they asked for help. And so they were not afraid to ask for help. So I took all of that knowledge and information from my research, and then my experience with injury, and then the previous 10 years of all my work, and combine that all together to form Injured Athletes Toolbox. And so that's like my second injury. I knew how to deal with it because, you know, the monsters had already come knocking 10 years before, and I let them in and made friends with them all.
By the way, when you mentioned you did how many interviews? 200, you said? That's certainly the work of several doctoral dissertations right there. I can tell you, many qualitative studies that are published in academic journals have anywhere from 10 to 20 or 30 participants. I guess a couple things. You mentioned that when you were sitting beside the NFL player and the skier at the Stedman Clinic, there were some commonalities in just the three of your experience. Were those the same or different than the 4 points you mentioned of frustration, impatience, sadness, or anger, and being disconnected?
They were the same.
Yeah. So those themes kind of continued or reemerged when you did the interviews with that whole multitude of athletes, you said, of different levels and abilities.
Absolutely.
Why, just out of curiosity, why did you, I mean, it seems like quite an ambitious endeavor to undertake that many interviews. Like, what was the impetus for that? I know you said you wanted to understand people's experiences, but was there
curiosity?
something?
I'm an intensely curious person.
Yeah.
And also it was curiosity combined with a lot of time on my hands.
Right.
And I'm not really a television watcher. I don't binge on Netflix. I would rather learn, and I love learning about people, and like not just snorkeling, but really scuba diving and getting to know people's stories and paying attention to the words they use. I love to listen. So, you know, I'm that person that will go into my grandma's retirement home and I'll go find people to just tell me stories, tell me their story.
Yeah.
And so it's just, I mean, in one word, it's curiosity.
Right.
And then curiosity plus time. And then there was another arm to my research, and that was interviewing clinicians to figure out what are the challenges they face when they're working with injured athletes.
Yeah. What did you find?
Oh, that was also universal. So that was, it takes too much time because an athlete comes into an appointment with a broken leg, and it's, in my teaching and my talks that I give to clinicians, the one thing that I want them to understand is that the worst injuries are the ones you can't see.
Right.
And so clinicians are looking, as they should, at the injuries you can see, but there's this whole other part of the athlete that's ignored. And all that baggage comes into the exam room, and it's overwhelming in terms of time, in terms of that clinician has not been trained on how to deal with that. And so it can be overwhelming. And so lack of knowledge about how to address it, or
when you say,
go ahead.
Sorry to cut you off.
Yeah, no problem.
It takes too much time or lack of knowledge of how to address it. Are you, by it, you're referring to the quote unquote baggage or the.
Yeah. And I mean, maybe we should rename it, because it's not, baggage isn't exactly a right word. It's the normal mental and emotional fallout of an injury that every athlete experiences.
Right.
And I mean, there's nobody with whom I've interviewed or worked with that was really glad to be injured. Right. And so it's very traumatic, because many athletes so strongly identify with their sport. And this is not just a professional athlete, because the great majority of my clients are not professional athletes. Yeah. And it doesn't matter the level within the sport, the fallout's the same. So all of that comes into the exam room, and I call it the positive tissue sign. So maybe the physical therapist will say, "Oh, how are you doing today? What's going on?" And then somebody has a breakdown on the table. The physical therapist is going, I have another person in 30 minutes, and you have a whole PT schedule to get through, and I don't know what to say to this. I mean, I don't have time. I don't know what to do. So those were the major things that came up, and it also creates schedule log jams as a downstream effect of, I don't have the time and I don't know how to deal with this.
Right. So I guess out of all of these interviews with athletes and clinicians, did that provide the basis for the work that you've been doing, providing coaching and support for athletes?
Yeah, in a way it did. So before I did my research, I had been working with injured athletes, about 2 to 3 to 4 at any given time. And so I had this vast well of experience before my research, but it was just, I wanted my business to be more than just my story and my experience. So I wanted it to be the voices and the words and the experiences of humanity, of all injured athletes.
Right.
And so I wanted more knowledge and more stories to inform what I was doing as a practitioner.
Right.
And so I had a really good foundation before that, but it was almost proofing what I had practiced before.
So maybe you can talk about some of the work, some of the types of people that you see, and some of the types of work or strategies, I guess, that you use to address some of those challenges that you mentioned, or what you do to help maybe in terms of addressing those things of frustration, impatience, the negative emotions, or being disconnected.
Yeah. How much time do we have?
Plenty, as long as, yeah. Like I said, they're working on my air conditioning, so I'm sitting here in Salt Lake sweating away, trying to, I don't know if you can see
what's the temperature there right now?
But it feels like it's well over 100, but I think it's in the 90s outside, but
oh my
toasty,
gosh,
toasty in my room here. But yeah, anyway.
I think it's like 105 here today. So
yeah. Well, we don't have the humidity that you do in Austin, so I'm on easy street, but hopefully the air conditioning is working well in your room there.
Moderately well. So I'm not sweating.
Yeah.
That's good. 2 thumbs up.
Yeah.
So I think, do you want me to talk you through a client with whom I've worked? So kind of a case study?
Yeah, sure.
Would that be helpful? Okay.
Yeah, tell us, like, without, of course, tell us about this client,
so
and respecting whatever confidentiality and
I can tell whatever the part of the story I need to, because she's been interviewed. She lived in the DC area. She's a Marine and been deployed to Hawaii. I'm really bummed for her.
Yeah, sounds rough.
Yeah. But anyway, she's been interviewed by the media. She's told her story. She helps other Marines now. And so, but before I get into her story, athletes will come to me and they'll say, well, how do I really know I'm getting better? How do I know that this is over? Or, we always want to know, where's the finish line, right? When am I done? When's the race over? And I tell them, when you can look back at this injury and reflect on it and have some kind of gratitude or perspective about why it happened and how you changed over the course of it. Yeah. And when you can help somebody else who's going through the same thing. Yeah. And I had a client just the other day. We've been working together for about 4 months, and her husband is Special Forces Army, and one of his female colleagues got injured. And so he said to his wife, can you meet with this girl? Yeah. And I said, you're not, our work isn't even finished and you're already there. Right. But for most people, it takes a while for that to happen.
So
go ahead.
Why those as indicators of, I guess, completion, or for lack of a better word, success of the work that you're doing? Gratitude and.
Yeah, that to me indicates a psychological shift about the injury. It means that the person is not, I use the word blended, kind of internal family systems modality of therapy uses this word, but when people are injured, they are their injury. Right? There's no separation between the self and the injury. It's just one thing. Right. And when those things can separate, or when they do separate, then people have perspective, and then they're able to help somebody else. And so it's the unblending to me that means people are, quote unquote, better.
Yeah.
So whatever that means, right?
Right. Well, yeah, and I guess that's, of course, a whole topic unto itself, right? Like, how does one sort of gauge when people are better? And also, I think certainly one of the areas of research I'm interested, which I think is implied in your comments, is this notion of growth after injury, that you're somehow you're changed by the experience, but not necessarily debilitated, but you have a sense maybe of gratitude, or you've developed social relationships with others, or taken injury as an opportunity to develop sport specific skills, or to maybe perform in a different way, or all kinds of different elements, I guess, that may be indicative of growth. But I guess one sort of debate on that is whether that's an end in and of itself. Like, earlier, I know you mentioned the term kind of mastering something, and and sometimes I wonder, well, does one ever master these things, right? Like, I mean, I wake up, I research the area and still wake up at night and perseverate at times. And so this idea of, growth is some end or end state that you achieve, I'm not so sure.
I completely agree with you. And I explain that to people, and my offering up, this is what you'll notice in yourself as you begin to heal. I think people need to see that perspective or that vision, but I explain to people that you're learning about yourself, and you can never master yourself. You're just, because you're constantly changing and growing. And as I think there's a lot of beauty, and I'm someone who falls into this category with nearly everything I do. There's a lot of beauty in picking things and incorporating things into your life that you can never fully master. And I think that's part of the furniture rearrangement in an athlete's head that needs to happen after an injury. Because what is an athlete practicing for, right? To master, to be the master at whatever they're doing. But to have that that story kind of shattered, and for them to realize, I'm not actually the master of anything. And that everything is fluid and everything is changing, and that's okay. And I can be okay in that state, because that's actually life, right? Control is just an illusion.
Sure.
So
I think, kind of having said the point that these processes tend to be ongoing, I think, like, just from the standpoint of providing support or coaching, it also comes to mind that, of course, like, people do want to feel like, depending on how the services and fees, that's a whole other issue, how that works. But it's sort of like, people also, of course, I guess, want to have some sense that they're not necessarily indefinitely being coached or supported, but there's also some sort of finitude, I guess, to the work being done as well. So I guess that's really tough. I
have actually two tools that I developed to help gauge that. So something that's more objective. So I can email you those, but one of them is a wheel that has I think it has 8 sections, and it says something like, I handle setbacks well, and then in that piece of the pie they circle 1 to 7, in terms of how they rank themselves in that area. So I have an attitude of gratitude, I celebrate small steps, things like that. And then I have another document that is an activity preference. And so there's a list of lifestyle preferences. So, to be alone, to be in a group, to move my body, etc. And then people pick their top 3 out of the list. And then next to that, they write the vehicle to get there. And so, it could be to exercise in a group, running, to be by myself, running, and then the third thing, running. Well, at the end of me working with someone, I have them go back to the list, and almost inevitably their preferences have changed. Again, they have, I help them build more than one pillar, and we can get back to the case study in a minute, but the preferences have changed, and the vehicle to get there has changed.
talk more about the case study.
Okay, so her name is Christine, and as I said, she's talked about her story, is open
Yeah,
about her story, has given me permission to share her story.
sure,
So,
sure.
so she is a Marine, and she came to me. She's two-time Marine Corps Female Athlete of the Year. She's a runner, and she came to me, and she had a labral tear in her hip. So the ball socket cartilage in the middle, the cartilage was torn, and she was at first really wavering back and forth about whether or not to have surgery. And this is common for people with chronic issues that kind of fly under the radar. And it's the whole pushing through the pain thing, right? She thought I could just push through the pain and live with it. So there was this intense amount of anxiety about, should I have surgery or not have surgery? A lot of emotional fallout from not being able to do her sport at her previous level. So she was 2 or 3 seconds short of qualifying for the Olympic trials. And so losing that identity, I mean, that was Marine runner, very much part of her identity. And so it was a classic case of, this is, she had 2 pillars, right? But these are my pillars, and they kind of both crumbled in a way. I mean,
Yeah,
she could still be a Marine, but she couldn't pass the physical test. And so there was some depression going on. And so and she had a lot of time on her hands because she spent a lot of time training and running. And so when clients start with me, I mentioned 2 pieces of paperwork, but I have a bunch of other paperwork, and I call it therapeutic paperwork, and it really is, because when people use their hands and a pen or pencil and write out some of their story and their goals, and I ask all kinds of questions, and I'm again happy to send this to you, but people get everything that's been in here onto a piece of paper, and it's just a huge pressure release. And so she didn't have goals. She was confused, she was lost, she was perseverating a lot. And so we took all of the time that she had on her hands, and the first thing I did was I made note of her depression, and I suggested that she see a mental health professional. And the wonderful thing about athletes is that their focus is usually here. It's training, racing, playing, whatever. So that innate drive and kind of stick-to-itness is all there, and I help them focus it into mental recovery. And so she saw a therapist, ultimately a psychiatrist as well, and worked on that, what I call is a barrier to moving forward, as I alluded to earlier. And then the next thing we tackled was, what are you going to do with the time on your hands? And so based on how she was wired, and again, kind of what Kelsey did with me, which is a hook into something that was a comfort zone for me, writing was a real comfort zone for her. So different writing prompts, writing exercises. She went to a writer's camp for runners, and she's a beautiful writer. The other thing that we did with her time and we agreed to was volunteering. And so she found a group of kids to coach. And she did this even right after her surgery on crutches. And that brought her so much joy and just made her forget about everything she was going through. And there was actually, she did coloring, and she kept a few journals. So she kept a journal of her frustrations. And so I call it taking the mental trash out. So every day she would spend 3 to 5 minutes and just write down everything that was going, like all of the perseveration in her head. Like, I'm not getting better. This isn't fast enough. I don't know what to do. I don't know if I should have surgery. She wrote that all down, tore it up, threw it out. And I had her keep a couple of other journals, and she did these things every single day. She started meditating too. And so that was kind of the start. And then then we dealt with the question of have surgery or not. And so one of the things that I do is help people discern what the right medical team should be. So I often see clients, like people will find me at 2 a.m. You know, they're up, they're in pain, they're suffering emotionally, they Google something, I come up. And so I have clients that come to me and they've, you know, Christine had hip pain for years. And so one of the foundations to physical recovery and emotional recovery is having the right care team. And so I helped her find the right care team. So someone that was fellowship trained by, you know, the guru of hip arthroscopy in the United States. And so helped her put together a proper medical team, and that gave her confidence in the decision to have surgery. And so it's, you know, combination of mental health, mental training, and then the right care for her physically. And it completely transformed her to the point that before she had surgery, you know, probably a month before, we had to have a talk, like a straight dope talk. And I told her, I don't think you're ready for surgery. If you go into surgery with the attitude and the mental state that you're in, you're not going to get better. And like a Marine, she put her head down and she did all of the mental work, like every single day she did it. And she started to feel less stress, less anxiety, less perseveration, just a lot more, like kind of like I got with photography, just space and distance from the injury and less identification with the injury. And then realizing this injury is a part of me, but it doesn't have to consume all of me. And she had a beautiful recovery, just a really beautiful recovery. And now she helps other athletes now, like other females in the Marines. And she's incredibly open about mental health and medication and, you know, just like destigmatizing all of that in the Marines, which is revolutionary.
Yeah. Well, and I guess, sure. And, you know, much like sport, I guess in the military, maybe there's a culture or tendency to work through or push through pain. What about, like, I guess, do you see kind of commonalities in terms of why some people are able to make effective recoveries? Again, that, I guess that could mean a lot of different things, but differences in the path or the trajectory that people are taking. And I know you've talked about things like an ability to sort of come to terms with frustrations or kind of teasing out one's identity from as an athlete and just sort of separating who they are from what they do. Are there factors, I guess, that you see that are consistent in some way that distinguish the path or differentiate athletes in their trajectory after their injury?
Yeah, I honestly think a lot of it has to do with healing past wounds. What I've noticed in my clients is that a lot of what drives them to not have compassion and to keep pushing through pain and never feeling good enough and never feeling worthy, which leads to, after injury, disobeying restrictions, right? So someone is supposed to be only going on 5-minute walks and they feel great and they're like, well, I'm going to go run some bleachers today. Then they have a setback, right? There's a whole chain of behaviors that leads up to that decision. So disobeying restrictions, doing too much or doing too little, not having motivation, all of these things I've noticed have roots in things from the past. And so a lot of my clients have trauma from the past of varying degrees and sources that make them good athletes. So their way of coping with that trauma was to become an exceptional athlete, or to have sports or running as a way to diffuse the pain. And so if they're injured and that's their only coping mechanism, what happens post-injury will be driven by the desire to quell the pain with the running. You see what I'm saying?
Right. So
And
if
so, go ahead.
training or sport, if training or sport is their coping mechanism and they can't do that, then they struggle.
Yes. And so I liken it to a weed. And so if there's a big weed growing in your ground and you mow over it with a lawnmower, but you don't dig down and pull the root out, the weed's going to grow right back.
Right.
And to me, part of the work and healing and transformation with injured athletes is what's pull the root out, what's at the bottom. And almost always that involves psychotherapy. That's not my job. I'm very good at identifying what might be coming up and saying, okay, this right here, that needs to be dealt with a mental health professional.
Right.
And I think that's so important. It's so important, because that whole process, it helps people feel again. And a lot of athletes they're afraid to feel, it's also the driver of so many maladaptive behaviors after injury, is they are terrified of feelings.
Yeah.
I don't want to cry. I don't want to feel anything. Where does that come from? Right. And I've noticed with my clients, it comes from stuff from the past. And it's so important to deal with that and to understand it.
Yeah. So, for whatever people may be experiencing with injury, of course, people are human beings and they bring to bear all of their past history and experiences to their current circumstance.
Yeah.
And if they're kind of underlining challenges, or you mentioned trauma or things that they've had in the past that, that may impede or I guess be a barrier to recovery. And I guess, as you mentioned, kind of getting people with the right training or the right background is important to, to use your analogy, I guess, to dig out what's underneath the surface or to get rid of the root of the weed.
Yeah. And it's important to, in a lot of cases, look back, but also, with a mental health professional, but also working with a coach like me to move forward and to have a plan for moving forward.
Right.
We've heard this expression before. It takes a village,
right.
And it really takes a village to help an athlete overcome an injury.
Yeah. So it almost sounds like part of what you're doing, Heidi, is providing some structure in the support, or a little bit of planning, or you mentioned like goal setting, or kind of mapping things out. And, you also mentioned that control is an illusion, but I suppose on some level, couldn't you also say that those forms of support are designed to instill some sense of control?
Absolutely. Because I think I would call it more influence, right? So we have the ability to influence our situation and our attitude.
Right.
But we can't control that we're injured. We can't, it is an injury. It, may or may not need surgical intervention. It's going to need healing time.
Sure.
But there's a whole part of us that we can influence, and, we can steer and guide. And so, control, influence, it's kind of on the borderline of all that for me.
Yeah, but I think it's an interesting distinction to be made, right? Like,
absolutely.
Of course, there will be things that the athlete can't necessarily control. If the ligament is torn and they want to do certain activities, then maybe they need to have the reconstruction of their ACL, for example, to engage effectively in certain exercises. But I guess on the other hand, influence kind of implies more, as you say, like you're shifting, steering, like, and also, I guess in sports psychology, we talk about kind of this idea of locus of control, right?
Exactly. Like, yes, exactly.
Yourself as the things that I do, and I guess control, maybe it could be locus of influence, and that what I do, does it matter in influencing the outcome, right? If I don't do too much too soon, if I listen to those prescriptions or restrictions, if I manage to work through some of these challenges that I've had before injury or currently, like maybe that will influence the course of the recovery.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think it's also worthwhile, and I know that this is right in your swim lane. What I talk about with all my clients is kind of nervous system 101. So understanding what's going on with your nervous system. We talked just a couple sentences about this earlier, but understanding that the stress, the anxiety, the perseveration, the depression all activates the sympathetic nervous system.
Right.
And as long as that is kicking and going and driving the car, it will affect healing. Yeah. And it will affect it affects everything, right? Sure. And so the things that I suggest people do and the structure that I give them, and then springboarding off of that creates goals. But the day-to-day things that people do are all based on things that engage the parasympathetic nervous system. Yeah. And when I talk about being a chemist, right? So when there's a reaction that happens, the energy is down here, and then the energy goes way up, and then it comes down, and then the reaction goes. And so athletes at the beginning, their brain goes back to swimming or running or whatever. Like as I said before, if I can't do that, then I'm not going to do anything else. So it's very binary. And I explained to them it's normal, it's natural. This is what's going on. Like your brain is resistant. Your brain has worn a rut into sympathetic nervous system thinking. And this is how it appears in your everyday life. You feel like you're going to throw up. You don't have an appetite. Maybe you eat too much. Maybe you feel like drinking. All of these things come up. And when you start to walk on a different path and use your sympathetic nervous system, it's a lot like bushwhacking and finding a new trail. Like you're going to get cut. You're going to step into holes. You're not going to want to go any further because it's scary. And what that is you're overcoming the activation energy of that reaction. But if you can hang in there for a little while and kind of send yourself to boot camp and make yourself do these things every day, then once you get up here, you'll realize, oh my gosh, I feel so much better. And then things will go. They'll go. So I was talking to a client the other day, and she's had a 3 or 4 week break from parasympathetic nervous system overdrive. And she said, I had a setback the other day, which is normal in every recovery. And it's something that I talk about with my clients, and I explain to them how to deal with it. 1, 2, 3, do these things. But she had a setback, and she dealt with it beautifully. And she said, when I had that setback, I noticed that all my pain came back. I had shallow breathing. I felt like I was going to throw up. All my pain came back. And she said, and it was only then that I realized, oh my gosh, this is what it used to be like. This is what I feel like. Yeah,
to have that point of contrast or comparison.
Yeah. So people need to understand the why, right? Not just the how or what, but they need to understand the why of what they're doing.
So to understand the rationale of the reason, are you referring to their own motivations or just the reasons why something is being
they need to understand physiologically why.
Yeah.
Why the work is important and what it's doing to change them, and what they may begin to experience, the changes they may begin to experience physiologically. Right. So that to me is the why of this work.
Yeah, and I think, you mentioned kind of that binary thinking. I guess when individuals, as in any conundrum or problem, challenge that someone's having, if you think that it's either this or this, then that constrains, or when your thinking is constrained in that way, then that can generate stress, right? Either or sort of propositions are less helpful than having multiple options of what you might select. Oh, I could take this path, or there's this option, or maybe there's more possibilities than I realized. So sort of the work of generating possibilities rather than closing them off.
Exactly.
Also, I think like you kind of keep coming back to behaviors, and I guess, we talked or sort of made reference to that connection of thoughts and emotions, and then the link between behaviors. And I guess it's not only the fact that, well, if you're having negative thoughts or emotions, that it influences you physiologically, but behaviorally.
Yep.
So it's kind of
Absolutely.
like, you know, if I'm frustrated and I can't get out of a hole, I'm feeling continually sad or angry, which is normal, but maybe at a certain point that will impact your motivation, which you mentioned, or more behaviors, right? Like what you're doing on a day-to-day basis. Yes. And, you know, I guess if you think, oh, well, this is pointless, I can't overcome this, then why would you put in effort to try and recover or engage in certain actions? So I thought that was interesting. I like taking notes often as people are chatting, so it's just writing a few things down. Maybe you can talk a little bit, Heidi, about, you didn't explicitly make reference to expectations, but I think it was implicit in your comment that for athletes, there's, you know, when they face a setback, learning how to deal with it. And I'm wondering if, in your experience, there's the expectation or assumption that it's going to just be a straightforward uphill road to recovery.
Yes. I wish that more clinicians would set people's expectations that setbacks are normal.
Yeah.
It's completely abnormal to have an injury recovery without setbacks.
Right.
And so most people don't know that the freight train is coming until they've been run over by it. When I work with people, I explain that at the very beginning. And, you know, we don't know when it's going to happen. We don't know what it's going to look like or how long it's going to last, but it's normal. It's very, very normal. And here's what you do when that happens. First, everyone with whom I work, I have them keep, I call it an activity journal, or people might call it an exercise journal or whatever. But I have people keep it for 3 reasons. One is for their physical therapist, right? They might ask, what have you been doing? What exercises you're doing? But if somebody has a setback, that journal can be used as forensics to go back and go, you know, I feel like crap on Wednesday and I didn't really do anything yesterday, but Sunday and Monday, I walked double the time I had been walking. Yeah. And that's how a lot of setbacks happen. The body doesn't give us cues that we're doing something wrong until 2 days later. And then we forget that we did it. Yeah. So it helps with that. And then it also helps with, this whole concept of eventually down the road, you're going to meet somebody else who's going through the same thing. And they're going to ask you, it's never really a good idea to compare injuries, but they're going to ask you, you had ACL surgery. So what were you doing 3 weeks after your surgery? Or where were you at this point? And so that journal can be a tool to help other people. Right. And also an athlete's brain, and everyone's brain, frankly, is going to say, it's never fast enough. This is moving too slowly. I'm not getting better. And that journal is a reality check for the brain. Because inevitably people will look back and go, yeah, I had surgery a month ago and now I can walk around the block. Is it what I want to be doing? No, but I am getting better. Yeah. And so that I have people keep that when they have setbacks. So I say, if you have a setback, immediately reach out. So don't sit there suffering and perseverating and blaming yourself and getting down on yourself. Reach out. So reach out to me, reach out to your clinicians, preferably, if you have a physical therapist, reach out to your PT, let them know what's going on. Yeah. Set up an appointment, look back on your activity journal, figure out why it happened, and then move forward. But mostly understand that it's completely normal that it's going to happen. It's going to happen. And I tell people, when you're, if it's a roller coaster, right? So you're going up, but when you're going down, people think, oh, I've lost everything, right? When you're going down, you're still moving forward. Mm-hmm. You're not going straight down, you're going down and still moving forward. Right. And, like, what's the trend over time? Sometimes when you're in it, it's hard to see Exactly.
the overall pattern. But
Yeah.
as you say, I
The
guess things
bottle.
like,
It's the
yeah,
bottle. It always comes back to the bottle.
right, right. It's, helpful to have analogies to explain things, I guess, for lots of things in
Yeah.
you. Um, Maybe you can talk a little bit just about communication. And, I know sometimes athletes will see a doctor, for instance, and they leave and you ask them to recall what was said and not
Yes, yes.
much, right?
And you probably know this. I've read some articles, and though the range varies quite a bit, I've read any that we forget between 20 and 70%, depending on which article you're reading, of what happens in a doctor's appointment.
Yeah,
And so what I tell athletes, especially because there's a huge emotional component to it, and if our sympathetic nervous system, so fight or flight, heart racing, sweaty palms, all that stuff, if that's going on, you're not thinking and learning. You're just trying to survive.
right.
So plan for the appointment. So one of the things that I do is I help people plan for medical appointments. What do you want to get out of it? What questions should you ask? And remember that clinicians are generally very objective thinkers. And so you want to get a proper diagnosis, a plan of action. But it's not a great idea to come into that appointment with, though it's very valid that somebody has this, you don't want to come into that appointment with your anxiety and your frustration and all of that. Like that needs to be handled separately.
Yeah,
But plan for the appointment, make a list of questions. If you have a loved one or friend that can come with you to take notes, bring that person. And I think what helps most people, and I always say ask for permission before you do this, but record the appointment.
yeah,
And I so far have not had a client where the clinician has said, no, you can't record the appointment.
yeah, sure. Yeah, I
And
mean,
so
generally,
it's very helpful.
yeah, yeah. I mean, I think for the most part, of course, practitioners want clients to retain the information
Mm-hmm.
they're giving them, and it can be a source of frustration, of course, when they don't. So I think, most are, yeah, happy to have tools to aid in that recall or
Yes.
internalization of information. Um, yeah, I guess one of the things I'm interested in, certainly, I guess from an applied standpoint, also certainly from a research standpoint, is this idea of determining when athletes are ready to return. And of course,
Oh, yeah, yeah.
you spend a lot of time, energy, and effort, months, perhaps
Mm-hmm.
years in some cases, and then it's all like, well, am I going to be able to, is it worth it? Am I going to be able to get back and do something I love? Or all these questions that may loom large or that kind of become more present in the athlete's mind as maybe there's an impending return to activity. And I guess what thoughts might you have about when athletes are ready, or if you're working with some of the athletes that you're coaching and supporting, are there things that you're doing to help them make that transition back into maybe more intense sport activities or competitive activity?
Yeah, that's a big question. And I think people fall into two categories. There are definitely some athletes whose coaches and trainers, and for whatever other reasons, they're being pushed back into play before their body's actually ready. And
Yeah,
so
sure.
I'm not going to address those people because there isn't anything that I could do or say to change that. Maybe some more self advocacy on the part of the athlete, but some of these things they're not in their control. There's contracts, there's all kinds of complications there that I don't want to get into. But the athletes who can return to their sport of their own volition, I tell them, get objective evidence that you are ready to return to your sport. And so what I often hear is, and this has been my own experience with past injuries, is that um, a surgeon's job is to surgically repair things that are broken, and a physical therapist's job is rehabilitation.
Yeah,
And so a lot of people with whom I work have been told by a surgeon, slowly return to your sport, or after 6 weeks, you'll be ready to return to your sport. And
Yeah.
then that athlete won't end up going to physical therapy. And physical therapy it's a must. It's a must for many reasons, because if an athlete isn't going to go from let's take something straightforward like a broken femur, right? Put a rod in it. It's pretty straightforward, right? It's broken, put a rod, that person is fixed. The broken bone is fixed. But what happens around the body, and what was the mechanism of injury, is probably pretty violent to break a femur. So what other neuromuscular chains have broken in the course of that injury? So I think that's a really typical injury where a surgeon could say, just slowly get back to your life, and then unknowingly an athlete could return to their sport and have all of these dysfunctions that lead to more injuries. So that's why it's always important to find a good physical therapist, and specifically looking for a physical therapist who has an SCS or OCS certification, and you can look online to find them.
Yeah.
So those
What are those? Sorry, go on.
An orthopedic certified specialist or a sports certified specialist.
Right.
And so these are people that have a higher level of training and understand more about load, fascial connections, and they will tend to look at the whole body. So you may have an injured knee on the left, but guess what? If you don't look all the way up the chain, in like 3 years, that person's going to have a left shoulder problem.
Yeah.
And so someone that can identify these SCS and OCS PTs are much better equipped to handle these types of situations. And then a physical therapist who understands gentle reloading and measuring the amount of load on joints. And so there are numbers, like let's say for a knee injury, you can measure on a variable inclined plane how much load somebody can handle, and the amount of load that they need to be able to handle to walk or to run or to get off crutches. And so you have numbers guiding you the whole way, and the numbers in the work with that physical therapist is what creates that trust, and ultimately working with them is a partnership. And then the decision to return to the sport should be from the perspective of the relationship with the physical therapist.
Yeah.
And I strongly believe in that. And if somebody has an injury and isn't seeking physical therapy and the right kind of physical therapy, the old just return when your body's ready, it's a recipe for failure.
Yeah. Well, and many, physical therapists, sport medicine physicians are moving more to a criteria-based approach in terms of return to play. And as you allude to, ensuring that athletes can display indicators or show objectively that they can meet certain strength or functional requirements, proprioception, endurance, whatever it might be. So that it's not just, I think I feel ready, or I'd like to return, or as you talked before, my judgment is clouded and I really, really want to go back. But,
it's my only coping mechanism. Nobody wants to be around me unless I can do my sport.
Right. And of course, as you also mentioned, I guess some of those functional capabilities, whether that meshes with time constraints is a different issue.
That's a different animal.
And, you're right. And particularly with professional athletes, all these other sort of external factors may come into play that impact, I guess, things like, whether they meet certain criteria and in fact return or not. But
yes,
I think certainly I agree. There's definitely a movement towards more objective or functional assessments to ensure that the athlete is ready. And certainly many colleagues talk about the fact that often the two, physical and psychological, go hand in hand, right?
Absolutely.
Physically ready and demonstrating that your knee, for instance, can meet the load. Generally, there's more, heightened psychological readiness, I guess.
Absolutely, yeah.
Do you have any thoughts or pieces of advice you would share with injured athletes, Heidi?
Get help and don't do it alone. I think it's normal to feel like you've lost part of yourself, part of your identity. All of that is normal. It's a grief process, right? It's a whole process that people have to go through, and we can often go from place to place and the grief spectrum, 5 minutes to 5 minutes to 5 minutes. You know, we could be accepting of our injury and then be angry. And I think there's a balance between allowing the humanness and the normal emotional fallout to happen, but also understanding when it's time to get help. And so what I recommend to people is get with somebody in your life who is a label reader, like Christine, you know, somebody, a friend in your life that will give you the straight dope no matter what, and then you have to listen to them. And pick a date by which, if you're not feeling better about things, that you reach out and get help. And write that date on a piece of paper and hang it on your refrigerator, so when you go eat your Cheerios in the morning, you're going to see that date every day when you open the refrigerator. And if you're not feeling like, yeah, this is hard, but I got this, you know, I'm going to be okay by that date, then you get help. Yeah. And, you know, that help looks like working with somebody like me, working with a psychotherapist, but getting help is so important. And human beings, I mean, especially in our culture, we're so resistant to getting help, and getting help is normal. And I have a good story about that. So after, during the year I spent on my back, my mother's sister friend, Linda, came over with this, you know, just incredible spread of food she had cooked for my husband and me. And I was actually kind of angry about it. And I could talk to her about anything. And, you know, I said, I feel like I'm not worthy, like I'm a burden, you know, I don't want this help. I don't want to need this help. And she looked at me and she said, when your friends are in need, what do you do? And I said, well, I help them. And she said, and do you find joy in helping your friends? And I said, of course, of course, I enjoy helping my friends and supporting them and seeing them through tough times. And she said, stop stealing your friends' joy.
Yeah.
And I said,
well, that's
okay.
Very to the point. Yeah.
Okay. And I've surrounded myself with people like that. Those are my friends, and those are the people that are closest to me. They can be very honest with me and tell me whatever it is they need to say. And we all need people like that in our lives. Yeah. And so getting help, if you decide to go at it alone, my website is injuredathletestoolbox.com, and I have tons of blogs. I've distilled all my research down on my website. And then I have a lot of blogs that talk about all of the, you know, the stuff that nobody wants to talk about, like, you know, finding motivation, how to deal with conflict in your house after surgery, just like not getting along with family members. I wrote a blog for friends of injured athletes, like, how should you be with your friend who's injured? What can you do to support them? And so I've set my website up so that people can help themselves, but motivation is a big issue with injured athletes. And so I think if people can't find the motivation to do the mental training to take care of themselves from a mental and emotional perspective, get help. Yeah. And it's the best thing that you can do for yourself.
Right. Well, and I think those, you know, it sounds like your mom's friend helped you reframe the fact that you were thinking of yourself as a burden and not wanting to be one. And also, she also, I guess, in what the sports psych world we refer to as emotional challenge, I guess, sort of challenging you to kind of get over your frustration, or it sounded like your physiotherapist roommate did that previously as well. And so I think those are very important, tangible pieces of advice and suggestion for athletes. It's great to chat with you, Heidi. Are there?
Oh, thanks. I wanted to mention, you said that it's possible that sports clinicians would be tuning into this.
Yeah,
Yeah,
perhaps. Yeah,
yeah. And so I want to talk about really quickly the 5 signs that an athlete needs more help. So
yeah,
things that they're going to notice as clinicians.
yeah,
So one of them I call, and I alluded to this earlier, I call it the positive tissue sign. So if a patient comes in and you ask, hey, how's it going? Or how are you feeling? How are you doing? And somebody pulls out a tissue and they need to cry about it, they need more help. Not that the crying is abnormal, but that's an athlete's call for help,
yeah.
because we're not going to say, hey, I need help. We're not conditioned that way.
Right.
The other one is disobedience. And so not doing physical therapy or doing too much. It could be either or sometimes both. And then I call it MAD, so lack of motivation, anxiety, or depression. And then I call it Groundhog Day, and we've used this word a lot, perseveration, and that just means having a negative thought and thinking about it over and over and over, like, I'm never going to get better, I'm never going to return to my sport. Usually there are a lot of absolutes in there, but
Right.
if a clinician hears those things over and over, or when am I going to get back to my sport, when am I going to play again, some of that is normal. I mean, it's just people want to know, but if you keep hearing that over and over again, that athlete needs more help. And then also what I call a communication funk. So if someone says, hey, how are you doing today? And the athlete goes, fine, I'm
Yeah.
okay, I'm all right. So it could be that. It could be frequent calls, text messages, emails. So somebody that is blowing your phone up or blowing your email box up, that person definitely needs more help. Or an athlete just completely shuts down.
Yeah.
So they go into PT, they don't really say much, they just kind of follow directions, pretty silent. A lot of people would say, oh, that silence probably means, yeah, they're doing okay. Not okay.
Yeah.
That's usually someone that is crying for help.
Right. So I think that's an important point. Like certainly, you mentioned earlier, of course, the sport medicine providers, certainly people like the physical therapists or athletic trainers, although they may not have extensive background or training in the psychological
Yeah.
elements of recovery, ultimately, by and large, they're the ones who deal with the athletes most on a day-to-day basis. And so having some tools to recognize when an athlete may be in distress or when they're not functioning particularly well can be helpful. I think those are important signs or indicators. I guess others that maybe come to mind might be more observational in nature in terms of observing the athlete behaviors or nonverbal signs,
Mm-hmm.
right? Like how are
Yes.
they carrying themselves physically?
And
Um,
you've written about that.
Well, and like one tool, I was going to mention John Heil, my longtime colleague and collaborator. He presented a tool at the NCAA mental health, the Pac-12 conference back in January that helps
Mm-hmm.
clinicians kind of look, listen, and observe.
Yes.
Or like, what are they hearing athletes say? To your point about perseveration, like, are they
Mm-hmm.
hearing athletes say certain things? Just watching their behaviors, like how are they carrying themselves? Are they maybe choosing to engage in certain exercises or not? So if you give them a choice between doing something or not, and maybe they sort of opt out, or they decide to engage in maybe a slightly easier task than you think maybe they're capable of doing, maybe that's also an indicator that they're adapting less than optimally.
Mm-hmm.
So I think having those heuristics and tools can certainly be helpful and important in kind of gauging one's response and coping. So I think that those are
Yeah.
great points.
Yeah. When I talk to clinicians, I use lift.
Yeah,
So look and listen, and then of course, listen and silent are anagrams. And so this is the work of Dario Nardi, and he's a neuroscientist. And what he determined is only 2% of brains are inherently wired to listen.
Yeah.
And so the other 98% of us are thinking about what we're going to say next.
Yeah.
The patient we have to see next, all the documentation that we need to take care of, all the notes, the return phone calls, emails, stuff. And if we can listen and look, as you're saying, and that means being silent. It just means being with that person and being silent. So that's the first step. And then the next step I call investigate feelings. And I created a screening tool based on my research and the frustration, anger, sadness, impatience, and disconnection, 2 questions in each category, where people rank themselves. This is not me, this is me. And so that's a good way to investigate feelings. And then the other one is to take action. So do you monitor that person? Do you just keep an eye on them? Or does that person need immediate mental health intervention? Or is it someone that, could be referred to somebody like me, and then I can determine, okay, this person needs to see me and a mental health professional, right? So there's different measures and a scale on that, but
and there's validated and reliable measures, for instance, on anxiety or depression that are common.
Yes, exactly.
In mental health settings. And to your point, Heidi, there's, depending on how the athlete scores, there's prescriptions for what practitioners can then do based on the score. So, if on the PHQ, for instance, or, depression questionnaire, you're scoring in a certain range on that inventory, then if you're low, then maybe you're doing fine. If you're scoring higher, then maybe there's an indication that the practitioner needs to refer in instances where they don't have appropriate training or background. I think one of the limitations or challenges with all of these kinds of self-report measures is just that, they're self-report.
Exactly.
People's, desire to, return to sport, for instance. There's a questionnaire developed by a guy named Doug Glaser. He has 6 questions about whether the athlete feels confident in their ability to return. Well, if you're got a competition that you really want to compete in 2 weeks or in a week from now, you're probably going to self-report that you're feeling pretty confident if you want to return, and that someone's making a decision on the basis of those inventory. So I think if nothing else, they can be used to inform conversations and, inform decisions. But I suppose, like most single sort of indicators, they all have some strengths or limitations. And I think that's
very
where,
true.
Using like multiple things, observing what does the clinician based on their experience see? What do they hear? What do they get back in terms of feedback from the athlete, so you can kind of triangulate those kind of data points, I guess, if you will, or sources of information. But yeah, I guess like most things, it's tricky, right? These things, whether it's sort of gauging someone's adjustment, there's sort of an art and science to working with the individual and the rapport that the person has who's providing support and how they interact with that person. So lots of things.
And you read my mind about art and science, because I was going to say this sits right at the corner of art and science.
It was interesting when you were talking about, actively listening. That's a challenge, I guess, for lots of us. And I think, part of, you mentioned the fact that, well, when the person's listening, are you actually thinking about what you want to say or your next thought? And there are scales that assess whether people are actively listening.
Interesting.
And there's some great questions. Like, I think, I can't remember, one, I think I came across this in John Gottman. He's a researcher who does
Oh,
stuff
I
on,
know him.
yeah,
Yeah,
so
yeah, he's great.
best-selling books.
Uh-huh.
And I think in one of his books on principles of effective relationships, he has inventory that asks people about listening. Of course, in any relationship, things tend to break down if people aren't listening very effectively to their partner or significant other. But it's hard, though, isn't it? Because when someone's talking, I think it's a normal response or tendency when they say something, as you're listening, it often generates a thought. And then it's hard to be entirely immersed in what the person's saying because you're trying to retain the thought on some level. So that's a tough one. But.
It's that plus the fact that most of the people in our country are extroverted thinkers, and
right.
There's a discomfort with silence. And so if somebody is listening with focus and intention, there inevitably is going to be a silence between one person speaking and the other person speaking, or somebody asking a question and somebody responding.
Yeah.
And so as someone who pauses a lot, I'm comfortable with that, but a lot of people don't want those silences.
Right. Well,
they don't want those pauses.
Yeah. And I agree. I think like sometimes there is discomfort in silence, but also, as you mentioned, there's a cultural element to that as well, right? Like,
yeah,
you know, particularly maybe in this country and the US, maybe there is a focus on saying your piece as opposed to digesting what others want to say.
Right. Right. I tell people that in between a stimulus and a response is a pause. There's always a pause of varying length, but in that pause is your power.
Yeah.
Right. So take a breath, collect yourself. What are you going to do in that pause?
Yeah, I think that's a wise thought point. A great point to perhaps conclude our discussion. I don't know if there's other thoughts you wanted to share. I mean, we've talked about different aspects of injury. Are there other things that you feel are important to the injury experience, or things that
there's lots of stuff.
Yeah.
I feel like I could talk to you for hours and hours and more hours than we've already talked, but I think we've covered a lot of ground. And you know, if people need to find me, again, it's injuredathletestoolbox.com, and then my email is heidi@injuredathletestoolbox.com. And I am one of those unicorns that will respond to emails, and I won't ignore anybody. So reach out if you need help.
Yeah. Well, thanks.
And that's both from a clinician side and from an athlete side.
Yeah, no, I think, as you mentioned, it's important for athletes to know that they have resources and support and people who can help them work through. I think I just had this thought about, I'm always, going back to different studies that pop into my mind. There was one study with Olympic champions where, they asked them kind of what were some of the factors that enabled them to achieve that athletic accomplishment. And certainly one of them was support. And athletes talk about just the fact that, one athlete said, my mom would listen to me and was a sounding board for me. Or so,
yes.
As you mentioned, kind of finding not just anybody, but the right people who can provide certain types of support, whether it's listening or just allowing the person to vent or,
and the right kind of support is, you hit the nail on the head with that.
So, I think certainly injury is a challenging experience, but again, I think hopefully people who have watched have gotten some ideas and certainly some concrete ideas and strategies to facilitate their coping. So thanks for taking the time to chat, Heidi.
Thank you, Les. This was great.
Yeah, definitely. Hope to speak with you again soon.
Likewise.